The vast majority of people believe if I cannot look you in the eyes, I must be lying.
You can certainly wonder, why does that belief not go away? All the debunking, all the effort, it's worthwhile asking why it won't go away.
Welcome to this exclusive interview with Professor Maria Hartwig. Maria is a leading expert in the field of criminal psychology. In this interview, we will be discussing a range of advanced techniques and methods related to deception detection and information gathering. We will be diving into investigative interviewing, including the Scharff technique, strategic use of evidence, cognitive interviewing, and criteria-based content analysis, to name just a few. Also included in our discussions are controversial methods such as the Reid interrogation technique, a coercive confession-oriented method, and the advantages of information gathering approaches such as the peace model. We are doing all of this while we are exploring the nuances of interviewing, interrogations, and negotiations. And of course, we are also discussing the various myths and misconceptions about deception detection, some of which are deeply ingrained in folk psychology, and the reasons why it is almost impossible to eradicate them. It's important to note that this interview is not for anyone just casually interested in deception detection. Instead, it is intended for professionals who depend on accuracy in their work, such as law enforcement officials, intelligence analysts, and legal professionals. The techniques that we are discussing are all essential tools for professionals who need to identify the truth and make informed decisions based on available evidence and scientifically validated methods. Understanding the strengths and limitations of these methods is crucial to effectively apply them in professional settings. In this interview, Professor Hartwig will be sharing her insights and expertise on these topics and outline the practical applications. So I would say sit back, relax, and get ready to learn from one of the leading experts in the field. Maria Hartwig, thank you so much for joining. It's my absolute pleasure meeting you from Amsterdam to New York.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I have a number of notes in front of me, and you were kind enough to send me a couple of your research papers, which I read, so I also have notes about them. Very briefly, you have a PhD and you are a professor of psychology at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Yeah, you're director and co-founder from Project Aletheia. I hope I pronounce it correctly, Aletheia.
You did,
right?
Yeah, you did.
We will discuss this in a little bit. You did a lot of deception research. This is actually how I came, how I stumbled on your name when I did my own academic research. And you did a lot of work together with Charles Bond, Per Anders Granhang, I hope I also pronounce his name correctly, and of course Albert Frey, which is here from the Netherlands. So those are state-of-the-art names when it comes to deception research, and you are absolute in these spheres with them. I also see you have a couple in that sense. I found two of them, early career awards, right? One by the European Association for Psychology and Law, and then there's another one which I didn't know, the Salem Shah Award. Tell us something about that one.
It's an award given by the American Psychology and Law Society, which is a division of the American Psychological Association focusing on psychology and law. So it is meant to reward people for early career excellence. And okay. I was enormously humbled to receive those awards.
Yeah. So the question is, of course, what did you do? What did you do to receive?
I celebrated and I put them up on my wall in my office, and I look at them whenever I'm there, and I am honored. I'm greatly honored. And it will be a while until I'm even eligible for any other awards, because typically in the academic world, if you're lucky like me, you might get an early career award, and then it's at the end of your career. And I'm not there yet, so.
Okay. What I meant was, what did you do to get them?
Oh, what did I do to get them?
Yes.
I spent a lot of effort doing research. What I think it's hard to speak for the committees that gave me these awards, but my doctoral work and the work that I then built on after my dissertation has been quite critical in changing the nature of research on deception, and in particular by identifying a field we call interviewing to detect deception, whereby judgments of deception occur in the context of an interview or an interrogation. And other people have studied that type of situation as well, but as part of the work that I did with Per-Anders Granhag and also Albert Vrij, we provided some prescriptive guidelines for how to conduct interviews with suspects in order to improve lie judgments. And that's generally under the umbrella term of strategic use of evidence, or the SU technique, which was, again, part of my dissertation work, which I began 20 plus years ago. And we can talk about this in more detail at a later point if you're interested, but we are now at a point where the SU technique is actually implemented in police practice in a number of places, including in the United States, and including at significant places in the United States. For example, at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers, FLETC, which is the government's main branch for federal law enforcement training. All their students are now trained in the strategic use of evidence technique. So it has taken on in a way that I never could have dreamed of.
This is really good news. I had a brief exchange coincidentally on my LinkedIn account with Wigländer Zulawski. I don't know if you know this company. You probably might. That's a massive company who has peddled the Reid interrogation technique for decades. They stopped, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. And someone from the company wrote, it's time that we get pseudoscience out of the courtrooms. And I responded, well, that's a daring, comment for a company who peddled this, Reid methodology for a long time. And then they said, well, yeah, but we are trying to be better now, yeah. But that exactly misses the point that at this day and time, we have tens of thousands of police officers out there applying the Reid interrogation methodology still. So it's very good to hear that you succeeded in, countering this shall we call it methodology, coercive interrogation technique with something better. Quick question: Hans-Joachim Scharff.
Yes.
That sounds a little okay. Can you elaborate?
Yes, Hans Scharff was an interrogator of the Luftwaffe in World War II, and he had a reputation for being enormously effective, using only rapport-based techniques. He got POWs to admit to a whole lot of critical information, and one of his tricks, although I don't mean trick in a deceitful way, one of his capacities was to generate information from the targets of his interrogations without them knowing that they had given up information. So they would walk out of an interrogation with him saying, I didn't help them at all. I didn't say anything that they didn't already know. So he created an illusion of knowing everything, partly by learning everything he possibly could about the person that he was to interrogate, and everything related to their case, everything that he could possibly find out. And he used this strategically during his interrogations to create the perception that he already knew everything. And therefore, the logic is basically that suspects will realize that it is futile to deny anything that the interrogator already knows. So part of his genius was an extraordinary capacity for rapport building, but also a massive command of the details surrounding the person that he was interrogating. So the Sue technique and the Scharff technique, for a long time, Scharff was just mentioned as an example of an exceptional interrogator who managed to do something, generate information disclosure, but we didn't really know how, or there was no systematic attempt to try to boil down his work into principles that can be applied. However, my former advisor and current collaborator and dear friend Per-Anders Granhag has done exactly that. He has systematically studied what Scharff did, how he did it, and he has taken that knowledge and turned it into principles for effective interviewing, specifically interviewing that is aimed towards getting a person to disclose new information. So there is now a significant research program on the Scharff technique. And here's how the Scharff technique and the Sue technique are interrelated. The Sue technique is based on considering suspects' counter-interrogation strategies. So if I'm going to interview you, Thomas, it's likely that you're going to have some strategy for how to prevail in this interrogation. Let's say that you've actually done something shady that you don't want me to know about. You're unlikely to walk into the interrogation just cold. You're likely to have some ideas about what to do and what to say. And we hypothesize, and this turns out to be true, that what kind of counter-interrogation strategy you're likely to use is a function of your perception of the interviewer's knowledge. So if you don't know what I know, or you think that I might not know much, the default strategy is going to be withholding information. And the Sue technique exploits the fact that suspects tend to use these avoidant, withholding counter-interrogation strategies to make them backfire, and result in the suspect contradicting known facts. The Scharff technique is based on the same idea that suspects form a hypothesis about how much you know, and they understand that it's futile to deny what's already known. So they're different manifestations of the same reasoning about suspect's state of mind and how to outwit the suspect using your information and your knowledge about their strategies. So both these techniques render interrogation not as a battle of who can shout the loudest, but who is operating with the most wit.
Yeah, that's why I brought it up. I read Scharff's autobiography, as a biography, written not by him, but by a person who met him later in the US, because he was invited to live in the US and to teach his practice. I was mildly disappointed. It's a good book, yeah, but I was mildly disappointed because it does not outline, except some generalities, his methodology.
Yes.
It was a really interesting read, but it reminded me when you said strategic use of evidence. That's what I read in his biography.
Right? Yes, it's an approach that's very closely related. The difference is in the objective, where the principal objective of the Sue technique is to generate incriminating denials that are implausible.
Yeah. We are already in the middle of this interview, yeah, and you provided two main topics, and I'm happy to elaborate here. So one is, and we are already discussing it, science-based interviewing and interrogation, and we will continue with that. But then there's another field where you really knowledge about, that's the psychology of deception and its detection, right? And yes. I think to some extent, of course, this will overlap, yeah. But again, from I try always to put some practicality in these kind of conversations, right? So I come from business. I'm really interested in high stakes business negotiations. I did my master's on that topic, and I'm always looking for things that, could be applied. Yeah. At least to some extent. Yeah. So if we keep this in the back of our mind, but when we talk about interviewing and interrogation, both of which could mildly compared sometimes to business negotiations to some extent, right? So what are your key findings when it comes to interviewing? Because those are two totally separate topics, right? Interviewing and interrogation. What are your key findings over your long career so far?
Well, I would say that it depends on how you use the terms, whether they are two very different things. So in traditional US policing, interview denotes either an interaction with a witness or a victim, or a non-accusatorial information gathering interaction with a suspect. And as you know, the traditional Reid model and the American police interrogation model in general, whether Reid has created this or not, I think is a matter of some debate. But nevertheless, they in these models invoke the term interrogation to denote the stage at which the interview turns from an information gathering enterprise into a confession oriented enterprise. And that is the point at which they apply all these social pressure and social influence and persuasion tools and manipulative kinds of devices in order to essentially change your mind from the default view that confessing is not in your best interest to that admitting to this crime is your best option. And these are very, very powerful tools that very effectively break down suspects' resistance. There's been a bit of controversy around the word interrogation. So when some European countries moved away from coercive interrogation practices, it happened earliest in England and Wales, where they passed legislation in the early 1980s regulating how suspects would be treated in custody, including during interrogation. And as part of that reform movement, it was generally agreed upon that the word interrogation should no longer be in use because it has these connotations of accusatory and pressure-based questioning. I take a slightly different view. I don't think the term interrogation is inherently morally charged. I think that it's a useful term to distinguish an interaction between a cooperative witness or a cooperative victim to that of a suspect interaction, because they are inherently different. Now, there's, of course, blurred lines here, but in general, when you're interviewing a witness or a victim, it's primarily about establishing a level of trust and rapport, and then getting as much information as you can from the person, and you have no real reason to think that they would be misleading you. However, an interview with a suspect has more structural similarities to that of a game, in the sense that it relies on the mutual use of strategies to obtain the objective. And these strategies and goals that the suspect, particularly guilty suspects, have, they're in conflict with the interrogator's goal. So I think that calling them all interview, I understand the impetus, because bad interrogation is bad. But I'm not sure that we need to dispense with the word I think what we need to change is how interrogations are carried out. Some dictionaries acknowledge that the term has a pejorative connotation. Some dictionaries just describe interrogation as questioning. So that's my stance. I have gotten in trouble a few times for using the word interrogation and been told that I should stop using that, but I don't really like word policing. And I think, like I said, that you can take the term interrogation to be morally neutral and instead talk about whether it's effective or not.
I think what very often happens is that the word interrogation is associated with a kind of confession seeking, whereby the interviewing process is more about information gathering, right? And that's also why the UK in the early 1980s switched from Reid to the peace model, right after a couple of high-profile wrongful convictions apparently turned out there. And in regards to interrogation, I saw an American study that showed that 75% of inspectors or police officers who go into an interrogation stated before the interrogation already that they believe that the suspect is guilty, right?
Yes.
So this is a massive bias on the part, because then you no longer look for all the evidence. You're just looking for a confession, right?
Absolutely. This is a huge problem. In some ways, looking at the classic legacy confession-oriented models, they are by definition guilt presumptive, because according to some of these training manuals, you're not supposed to even initiate an interrogation with a person that you think is innocent. And that is, of course, getting everything completely backwards, because the presumption of innocence stands. I guess my basic stance is that the labeling an interaction between a suspect and an interview doesn't take away the fact that it is a more complex and possibly more conflict ridden process. So just to make it absolutely clear, I am as much in favor of ethical, humane, human rights compliant practice as the investigative interviewing movement. I just think that there is some point to make a distinction between two sets of interactions that differ fundamentally in their structure and in their objective. So what happened after after the passing of legislative overhaul in England and Wales, the observational studies about the practice of interviewing, or interrogation, if you will, showed that the practice was characterized by ineptitude and lack of skills. And I'm fairly sure that this is a function of the fact that tools were taken away from the police, but no proper viable alternatives were offered instead. Now, the peace model came along sometime after, which were meant to provide a coherent framework for all interviews. The issue that I see with the peace model is that although there have been evaluations of the peace training, I don't know of any studies that demonstrate that the peace model actually leads to more information and more reliable information. There are certainly components of what is typically included in peace training that are established to be very effective. For example, the cognitive interview is a solid technique to improve the quality of testimony from cooperating witnesses. But the peace model as a whole, when it's been evaluated, what's typically being evaluated is the extent to which the trainees follow the peace training, which is only part of it, because it misses the operationally useful question of whether the techniques lead to better outcomes.
Yeah, I read a couple of research papers in regards to the peace model, and it's exactly like you said, they train it out, but then it stops there. Yeah, there's no support from the upper management to follow through. Yeah, so the application of the peace model, right, suffers at the moment. Yeah, the only advantage is the reduction of the false positives. That means people who admit to a crime that they have not committed.
Yes.
So here we have solid numbers who show that these incidences are decreasing or have decreased since then. Yeah. But when it comes to operational implementation, it's a problem everywhere. It's defunding. Nobody has the time. There's a kind of reporting involved. Yeah. I looked at the peace acronym, also the 5 steps, right? It all takes time and practice and supervision, and that's lacking. Yeah. But compared to the Reid model, I'm still positive about peace. Yeah. But
absolutely. Yeah. Sorry. Can I just clarify, lest I'm misunderstood and get lots of hate? The peace model is a definite improvement compared to coercive practices. There's no question that information gathering approaches, more broadly termed, lead to more information, fewer false confessions, probably more true admissions. It's the particular acronym of peace and the evaluation of what is called peace training that I find lacking in its persuasiveness, because I do not think that they have sufficiently demonstrated that it has effects on information yield. But again, if you take the broader umbrella term of information gathering techniques, which the Sue technique and the Scharff technique are part of, their information gathering techniques, then you're looking at a significant advantage in terms of the information gain, both in terms of the quantity and the quality of that information.
Yeah. The skill of the interviewer is so important because, again, according to a multitude of scientific research papers around the world, the deception detection accuracy of general law enforcement is the same as the John Doe on the street. It's about 54% of the time, right? And you get these numbers if you have, let's say, 10 truthful statements, 10 deceptive statements, and you let a judge rate, and then you average the results, right? But if you split it, if you look at truth detection and deception detection, it's even worse, because then the deception detection accuracy goes down to 20 to 30%, while truth detection goes up to 70 to 80% due to truth bias. Tim Levine and Stephen McCormack, truth bias, right?
Yes, this is correct.
So that's a real issue. But I tried one more time. A while ago, I asked you the question, based on your overall research, what would be the key items that you could recommend in an interviewing / interrogation setting, may it be in business setting or not?
I think that there are frameworks.
I mean, we know rapport building, we know, and there's a whole literature about rapport building, we know that, yeah. But over and beyond, specifically in regards to figuring out, is someone really telling the truth, you know?
Yeah, so I think it's worth pointing out, though, that all rapport-based approaches are not made equal. That all attempts to build and maintain rapport are not equal. And I think the best framework for building and managing and even understanding the concept of rapport comes from Lawrence and Emily Allison's work on Orbit, which has a proper theoretical foundation and is also based in a very rich set of data. So in terms of rapport gathering approaches, I would recommend the Orbit approach to managing rapport. I think the cognitive interview is a tremendously useful technique for people
Can you outline it briefly? Just briefly.
Sure. So the cognitive interview is one of the most successful outcomes of psychology and law research in the last many decades. The cognitive interview is a technique that is based on our fundamental understanding, uncontroversial understanding of how memory works. And the cognitive interview uses those principles to generate further recall. So, for example, one fundamental aspect of our memory is that it's organized like a network with different nodes. That means that activating certain elements of the network can activate related ones. There's also something called the encoding specificity principle, which states that when the conditions during encoding match those during retrieval is optimized. I think everybody has experienced something like this, where you go into a room and you're supposed to do something, but when you get to that room, you have no idea why you're there. And what do? You retrace your steps back to where you were when you were thinking about what you were supposed to do, right? So you're actually physically reinstating the context where you had the memory. So these two fundamental principles result, the researchers behind the cognitive interview are Ron Fisher and Ed Geiselman. They translated these fundamental principles about memory into techniques. One of them, instructions to participants, subjects, interviewee subjects. One instruction is to reinstate the context. That is, they're instructed to think back on the event that they are supposed to provide information about. And they are instructed to as much as possible, bring themselves back there in time and place. For example, considering the physical surroundings when the event happened, the weather, the spatial context, and their own psychological state, the mental context in which the encoding happened. Another cognitive interview technique is the instruction to participants or subjects or interviewees to tell everything. And the reason this works is, it's important for a number of reasons. The interviewee doesn't usually know what may or may not be relevant. So they might self-censor certain details because they simply don't think that it's relevant. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is that providing a recall where you include all kinds of memories can then trigger further memories. So if you're talking about this bus that passed by that has no real relevance to the story, maybe you remember an additional detail about the circumstances that you wouldn't have had you not been asked to report all details, even trivial or seemingly irrelevant ones. So those are the two, I think, most important components of the cognitive interview. They're very simple to implement. A cognitive interview might take longer and a bit more preparation, but it's really not that complicated, and the benefits are substantial.
I think contextual embedding is also one of the 19 criteria of criteria-based content analysis.
Correct.
Right? So there's an
There's an overlap there, and there's an overlap with the framework called reality monitoring.
Yeah.
Which also considers that self-experienced events are encoded in a context, particularly in a sensory context, because the only way something can get encoded into our brains is via our sensory system. I am not an expert on negotiations in any shape or form. My understanding is that the objectives are different in some ways from that of an information gathering interview or interrogation, but there is likely to be some overlap. In terms of techniques to recommend for that, I think... Yeah.
Really, high-stakes negotiation, it's not a one-time event, right? It sometimes goes over a year or 1.5 years, right? You start to know the participants to some degree. You start to understand what their objectives are. Yeah, but there's a lot at stake at these kind of negotiations. I have read at least 50 research papers on deception in negotiations. Yeah, there is a researcher called, I don't know his first name anymore, but Carr with double R. He states that deception are even necessary in order to succeed. Yeah, so there are all kinds of point of views when it comes to deceptions in negotiations. The one fact where all agree is deception definitely happens in negotiations. If the motives, the incentives, and the opportunity arises, because we are living in a very competitive world, right?
Yes.
So that's the background here, and which is why I'm thinking also interviewing and interrogation to some degree overlap, especially when we talk about information gathering. And a very simple example is you negotiate with somebody. How do you know that this particular person has the authority to negotiate over those things that you are negotiating with? Yeah, these kind of things, right?
Yes. Yeah. So these are complexities that are beyond my expertise. I think I'd like to invoke a credo by my partner in crime and co-director of Project Aletheia, Mark Fallon, an incredible man for a number of reasons. His go-to statement when it comes to deception detection is that the best way to detect lies is a known or checkable fact.
Yes.
And it sounds very simple when you say it, and it sounds very obvious when you say it, yet that is not the type of ethos that characterizes what practitioners who have to make deception judgments as part of their professional life, including negotiators, are being told, right? There's an abundance of guidelines for how to detect deception, but this fundamental point, which I fully accept, is very often lost.
It's lost because it's not sexy to be sold, right? There's a multi-billion-dollar industry out there selling all kinds of deception gadgets. Yeah, I most recently saw one on LinkedIn again, catering. What was it? Emotional real-time emotional recognition. I mean, I have those apps already on my iPad. Yeah, but I know what it takes. I can see. Well, anyway, it's by a long shot. It's not there. Yeah, but there is a multi-billion-dollar industry. My misconception was, I thought you have police, you have Secret Service, you have these agencies, they have already generations of experience. And I thought they collect this experience and give it from one generation to the next. Not true. Law enforcement buys knowledge from external companies, like the ones I already have mentioned. And some of those companies, they don't do due diligence, right? They are under pressure to sell, and they are selling what attracts buyers. This is how it is. Yeah. So
Yes, yes,
it's
this
a
is how it
very
is. And you very much nailed it when you said it's the alternatives are not sexy. Gadgets are sexy and cool, and the government has very long, for a very long time, failed to recognize that the problem of deception detection is not a technological problem; it's a psychological problem. So the obsession with psychophysiological measurements, for example, the so-called polygraph. These days, there are eye tracking types of tools.
yeah. Heat
Um,
sensors around the eyes, all kinds of
yes,
stuff. Yeah.
biometrics and stuff. The the critical. I don't know if the people who decide where the money goes didn't have enough toys to play with when they were kids or something like that, because uh, gadgets is really the name of the game. In addition to gadgets, there's also, as you know, a bunch of pseudoscientific approaches that I do not fault practitioners for swallowing. Let's say this scientific content analysis, scan, very very
Abhinam
common.
Abhinam Sapi. I interviewed him actually.
Interesting. I'll
Yeah.
take a look at that.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's called scientific content analysis. It maybe sounds scientific. I don't know. I haven't taken the training. But I'm not trained in how to do a raid, let's say, or how to wield a gun. As a psychologist studying primarily law enforcement, that's not part of my training. Police officers are not trained to tell the difference between what is proper science and what isn't.
Yeah.
And it's not as simple as a Google search. Because, as you know, for example, the Reid people are incredibly nefarious when it comes to claiming that their techniques are supported by
Yeah.
science. So what I think has to happen, and this is a part of what Project Aletheia attempts to accomplish, is to bring scientists and practitioners together where the merits of various techniques are openly discussed. So I mentioned earlier the federal law enforcement training centers as being receptive to the emerging science on effective interviewing grounded in law, science, and ethics. They've also done things like invite a whole bunch of academics to come to FLETC and talk to them about methods that they use in their training. For example, they used to incorporate neuro-linguistic programming,
Yeah.
which is a complete mess. And during one of their consortiums that they held, they had a researcher provide a thorough overview of just the extent to which that is not helpful, and they disbanded it. They walked away from NLP. So in this instance, the instance of FLETC, you have a situation where there's a degree of trust between the practitioners and the scientists, a mutual understanding that we're on the same page. We come from different perspectives. We come at it differently, but we really want the same thing, right? I mean, in my mind, I want the interview and interrogation practice to be better. I want it to be more humane. I want it to be more effective. And I don't want no bad, evil behavior or no bullshit either. And the practitioners want the same. They want tools that work. And I think this is one of the reasons why selling, I'm not making any money from the Sue technique, but so I hope you understand when I'm saying selling. It's very much within quotation marks. but to get buy-in on that technique is not very difficult, because the training is not based on a bunch of accusations about things that you are doing wrong. I'm not even talking about that. All I'm asking them is to be open-minded to this approach that some of them say they already use. Typically they don't, but they perceive it as a tool that they can add to their repertoire. So the adversarial nature of the relationship between the academics who study the best practice and those who actually are responsible for setting guidelines for training and policy and practice, that relationship has to be improved. And in the instances where there's a functioning relationship between practitioners and academics, you see really remarkable results. So, for example, I think it should be big news in the interviewing and interrogation world that the Federal Law Enforcement Center of the United States have entirely embraced a science-based curriculum. I can no longer in good conscience say that the typical police or law enforcement interview is a Reid one, because it's beginning to change.
Which is good.
I think on a local level in the United States, the Reid-like models, and again, I want to get this through, that I don't think the Reid people should get so much credit, because I don't think they invented anything. I think they just articulated a kind of coercive approach that is probably very intuitive. Like, if let's say you're my child, and I think you've taken a cookie from the cookie jar, and I want to get you to confess. I think I would use both maximization, if I didn't know better, maximization, saying, Thomas, you're in big trouble. The cookie's gone missing. And then I would minimize, saying it's okay if you tell me. You won't get in much trouble. Right? So these fundamental pillars of the Reid technique are very commonsensical ways to induce somebody to confess. So, but besides that, on a local and likely state level, these types of techniques are definitely the most common, but we are seeing the beginnings of a significant reform movement in the United States. And it's, of course, very, very late. It took a couple of
decades.
Yes, I mean, it in Norway, the reform efforts, as far as I understand it, began after one highly publicized case of a miscarriage of justice involving very coercive interrogation techniques. In the UK, it was these sets of the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6, etc. But it was a handful of cases, and in America, we're looking at thousands and thousands of wrongful convictions, many of them stemming from false confessions. So America has had to wake up for a long time, and that hasn't really happened. But I actually see it now. There is a transformation underway. And if the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center sets these standards, other agencies may very well follow.
A lot of credit to the Innocence Project in the US, which
Absolutely.
discovered, which work on this. The worst what I saw was I think 13-year-old black boy which was electrocuted, I think 40 years ago or so. We know today he was innocent. Yeah, crazy stuff. But I can't let NLP go so easily, and eye movements, right? Incidentally, yes. I was one of the speakers on the Behavior Analysis Congress in Prague, I think 3 weeks ago. And I still met presenters who pointed towards NLP. So I built into my speech, I told them about the Global Deception Detection Research Team. I'm pretty sure you know them. There are 200 scientists that did research in 43 countries. And they found that the vast majority of people believe if I cannot look you in the eyes, I must be lying. Whilst we know from empirical science that eye gaze aversion or any other type of eye movement has absolutely no relation to deception, right? So this whole NLP thinking, or I don't even want to go there, yeah, is thoroughly debunked, right?
It
But
is.
still, and this is where you're absolutely right. We cannot blame the practitioners or the law enforcement, because they're being fed this. They're purchasing in good faith. Yeah, they're being fed this type of information, right? But again, in the background, there's I said it already, a very strong industry who is responsible for feeding. It's in books, it's in workshops, it's in movies, it's everywhere. Yeah.
Yes.
If you know what to look for.
It is. Yes. Regarding the global deception research team, that was an effort entirely led by Charlie Bond. It should have been Bond and the global deception research team. I was one of the researchers collecting data for that project from Sweden, where I was living at the time. But it was really his undertaking, his initiative, and but you have
maybe we should stress. Sorry, maybe we should stress one thing, and I'm not sure I did this at the beginning sufficiently. Yeah? You are a heavyweight in this area, right? In deception research, right? I have quite a vast collection, if I can call it like this, of research papers. Yeah. And I checked, I found at least 100 papers, yeah, with your name on it. And in those papers, you have been mentioned 400 times. Yeah? So your work is referenced quite extensively. You're doing this already quite a while. I said it at the beginning. So you worked with some other heavyweights in this area, but I was not aware that you were one of the contributors for the global deception detection research team, right? So just another piece to the puzzle of who is Maria Hartwig.
Yes, right? I have been very, very fortunate in my career to have these wonderful collaborators. I think it was one of the greatest moments of luck in my life that I came across Per-Anders Granhag when I was an undergraduate student and didn't know what I was going to do with my life. But when I met him, I thought I want to do what he does. I didn't know how to do that or exactly what it was. But the importance of good mentors is impossible to overstate. Sorry. If we go back to the eye movement stuff a little bit, I find you can certainly wonder, why does that belief not go away? You know, all the debunking, all the efforts, all the empirical debunking, all the narrative articles saying please don't, it's not reliable. It's worthwhile asking why it won't go away. And I think that Charlie Bond and Bella De Palo, another major contributor to the literature, they postulated in their meta-analysis on lie judgment accuracy the double standard hypothesis, which I'm sure you know about, but for your listeners who might not, the double standard hypothesis basically prescribes or states that people have two different ways by which they look at deception. In one view, when you're lying to me, then it's bad and it reflects badly on your person that you're lying. But if I'm lying, then I have my reasons. People rarely lie just gratuitously. If you look at Bella De Palo's mapping of lying in everyday life, you'll see very easily that people lie for a reason. They found a tiny proportion of just totally gratuitous lies that were just meant to hurt somebody. But for most lies told, people have a justification and they rationalize their lies. So they don't feel the way they expect that another person is going to do when they're lying to them, right? Because when I do it, it's okay and I'm not feeling torn up about it. But if you're doing it, you're being bad, and I prescribe and project negative emotions onto you, which then result in these behaviors of being shady, looking away, or picking at your clothes and stuff. So essentially what they're suggesting, which I think is entirely correct, is that this view that liars give themselves away by these signs of discomfort and nervousness and guilt is because we want to think that liars feel that way. It's psychologically comforting. It's a bit unnerving to think that regular people can and will lie with barely any signs or repercussions. It violates the belief in a just world. But I think if you look around, there's enough evidence that the world is not a just place to refute that belief. But yes.
Absolutely right. When it comes to this discrepancy between our own behavior and what we see in others, yeah. If you take the eye gaze aversion as an example, yeah. Apparently, again, I said it. Apparently, everybody believes if I can't look you in the eye, I'm lying. But the liars, knowing that, right? This knowledge is so widespread that liars know that fact, and instead of looking away, they look more into your eyes.
Yes.
Than they would than truth speakers. Yeah? So there's this massive discrepancy from it's valid for the others, right? But not for me or not for the person I'm talking to, right?
Yes.
So there's a big mismatch there. Yeah. And when it comes to deception cues or stereotypical deception cues, I mean there are lots of. I mean I guess aversion is only one. Yeah. But there are plenty of those misconceptions. And again, the question is, why is it so hard to get out of our collective system? Right?
Yes, I think repetition is key.
Yeah.
So I'm invoking Fletzy again. Because I have a long experience of working with them, and when I started working with them, it was an uphill battle to try to disabuse them of these notions that nonverbal behavior is diagnostic, and it took quite a few rounds of saying that, and also other people saying it, and then saying it again and again. And yeah.
There's also another layer to it, right? Truth bias. I mentioned it before. Yeah. So most people think that when you live longer or long with someone, or the longer you know somebody, the better you can spot if the person is lying, right? Whilst in fact the opposite is true. Right? We know from empirical evidence, the longer you know somebody, the more you fall victim to truth bias, assuming this innate assumption that the person's speaking the truth. Why? In evolutionary terms, it makes sense because most of the time, most people told us the truth, right? So it's a very strong, and again, I've interviewed Tim Levine and Steve McCormack, separate, but also in preparation for my presentation in Prague together. You might want to have a look if you want to find out what they think, why those beliefs are so deeply ingrained. And again, talking about billion-dollar industry, right?
Yes.
Very, very nice gentlemen. Yeah. So there are multiple layers on, these mistaken beliefs. Yeah. Thinking, also this transparency principle. Yeah. Thinking that the behavior of others is transparent for us. Yeah.
Yes.
Now I have two more things. Also, kind of, yeah. I would like to discuss Project Aletheia a little bit, but before we do, the psychology of deception and its detection. And what I noted first, and this is the interview with Tim Levine and Steve McCormack, I called Yin and Yang of deception detection. Why? Because Tim Levine studied deception detection for 30 years and Steve McCormack deception production. Right. So for me, that fits perfectly together. And in your sentence from an email, you said the psychology of deception and its detection, which indicates to me you make exactly the same split. So for you, in regards to deception, and its deception as two different entities. What are your key findings, if you can encapsulate it in a couple of minutes?
Key findings are that cues to deception are not automatically present. That passive observation of behavior of people who are either lying or telling the truth is bound to be a very error-riddled enterprise. However, I think we're at a more positive point in time in terms of deception detection than we were, let's say, 20 years ago, because we are at this point in time able to point to certain elicitation techniques that make the difference between liars and truth tellers' stories differ. So in order for you to be able to catch a liar, you have to be actively engaged with them somehow. I don't see a solution to the behavioral observation problem. There's certainly certain circumstances, and some of them very practically important, where people have no access, practitioners have no access to behaviors other than demeanor. Let's say the airport screening situation.
It's another one. Demeanor. Demeanor is another. It's high up there with truth bias. Demeanor affects our perception of someone being trustworthy or not. Again, in the interview with Tim Levine, yeah. Yes. Good-looking, friendly extroverts are being more believed than their suspicious-looking counterparts. Yeah, especially yes. if the friendly, good-looking extrovert is telling the truth and the suspicious-looking counterparts is telling a lie, we have accuracy of about 80%. Yeah, but if we switch it, yes. If the friendly extrovert, good-looking person tells a lie and the suspicious-looking person tells the truth, we are down to 20-something% again. So truth bias, demeanor, those are the things people don't think about. So we have all the stereotypical nonverbal cues which not exist, but then there's also behavior, our own behavior and perception, which are misunderstood or not even known. Right? Yes. I just mentioned it because Absolutely. You mentioned demeanor. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I think you have to as a lie catcher. Some people take umbrage at that term. I just use it to denote somebody whose task it is to make a
credibility analysis. Credibility analysis.
Yes. They are in a better position to make judgments the more they know about the circumstances and the details around what they are after. So this is another way in which the truth and the effective practices are less sexy because they demand some work. You know, Ekman's training for, I don't know, last time I checked, the $300, you get a brief online training and then you're all of a sudden a deception detection wizard.
His facial action coding system takes a considerable amount of time, and I'm saying this because I'm certified and by Paul Ekman International, right? So I spent a lot of time a couple of years ago on studying microexpression, only to find out that they do not deliver on the promise that I assumed was given. Yeah,
it's another one of those ideas that are incredibly appealing. It's very nice to think that microexpressions work. It's nice to think that they exist. It makes some kind of a bit of an intuitive sense from a lay person's perspective, and then this lure of you can be one of the magicians too. I think leads to very good sales for his company indeed. But we've tested the training. It was incredibly hard to get that study published because we had null effects, and you know how journals are kind of prone to say you didn't find anything. Well, certainly is a finding that this widely spread tool doesn't do anything. And Ekman's typical complaint about the literature is that it's all laboratory based scenarios where people essentially pretend. He's entirely incorrect about that because there are field studies, and when we tested the microexpression training tool, we used real life high stake lies. Stimulus material that we gathered from various labs over the world. Yes. Project Aletheia.
Project Aletheia, yes. Tell me.
Thank you for getting the name right. Aletheia is a god in Greek mythology, a daughter of Zeus, who is one of the goddesses of truth. And I'm not going to get too academic about this because it will bore everyone. But I think it's worth noting that this term aletheia as truth had a bit of a revival in the philosophical literature with work by Martin Heidegger, who talked about aletheia, the concept of aletheia, truth as full disclosure, knowing everything, rather than a dichotomous correct incorrect, the absence of secrets, the knowing the full truth. So it seemed to be a fitting name. The genesis of Project Aletheia, which I founded with Mark Fallon, is frustration, mutual frustration. Mark Fallon is a 27-year veteran with the Naval Criminal Investigation Service, NCIS, and he has led some of the most significant counterterrorism operations in our recent history. Incredibly effective operator and a great champion for the science-based techniques. We had known each other for a while when we founded Project Aletheia, but it really clicked when we were in Washington, D.C. at one point, and we sat down and we were talking about the state of affairs. And we noted that most sensible people agree that the status quo is not tenable. Everybody is talking about that there needs to be change. And we essentially concluded that, okay, instead of talking about change, let's engage in change. It may be a bit cheesy, but sort of be the change you want to see. So let's take on the task of providing a platform for people who are willing to embrace change and who are interested in getting their job done right, which police officers and law enforcement and other forms of agents and officers, of course, they're motivated to get their job right. So we decided that the best way to advance the state of affairs is by bringing scientists and practitioners together in, again, a non-adversarial kind of way, where we can share knowledge, exchange knowledge, disseminate knowledge, provide mechanisms for change by being, by essentially offering practitioners the guidelines that they need, and the issue is not at this point in time what is it that we should do during interviews and interrogations. The issue is how to get practice to change. So of course, in the United States is incredibly complicated. There's no central mechanism for, as opposed to many European countries, there's no overseeing authority that has the power of transforming policy and practice in just one fell swoop. So rather, by highlighting these pockets of excellence that exist within the policing world. One example is FLETC, another example is certain divisions of the LAPD, which have entirely thrown out confession-oriented techniques, again in favor of science-based techniques rooted in law, science, and ethics. And to try to replicate those change processes across a bigger, on a bigger scale.
Maybe worth mentioning, because you said actually doing something. So Mark is just busy with trying to legally prevent police officers to lie to minors in interrogations, right? So can you tell us something about it?
Yes.
How did it go? How does such a project go? Right? You pick for whatever reason that specific topic, and how do you roll this out? How do you get that far?
In the case of the legislative change in interrogation policy for juveniles, we've long known that the practice is plagued by deceptive ploys. That it's very, very common method to use some kind of ruse to get the person to think that they're in worse trouble than they actually are, or to mischaracterize the nature of what they're accused of, or mischaracterize the consequences of admitting to the crime. So it was certainly not our initiative to bring this to a legislative level. That is largely a function of advocacy groups and the Innocence Project. But the role Mark has served in these hearings about introducing bans for deceptive evidence ploys for juveniles is part of a process to, bit by bit, move the practice closer to what we desire to see, what's consistent with the science. Now, I'm greedy. Like, I wish these bills were about banning interrogation, period. But that is not to imply any kind of disrespect for the efforts of the people pushing for these bills. I wholeheartedly support them. I just wish the practice was more ripe for a more significant change. But Mark's role in these hearings have been very critical, because the people who are against these changes tend to come from the law enforcement side. And they tend to say, based on my experience, this is a very important tool. And you're taking away, if you're going to ban it, you're taking an important tool away from me. And Mark's perspective is that of an exceedingly experienced and effective investigator who has understood that it simply doesn't work. It's counterproductive as a tactic. It backfires when it comes to generating reliable information. Also, it erodes the trust in the police, which in the United States is already incredibly frayed, right? In this post Black Lives Matter era, well, we're still in it. The relationship between the police and the community is very, very fraught. So Mark's perspective as a person who used to believe that people didn't falsely confess to crimes they didn't commit, and his prior beliefs about what was effective interrogation, and that has been informed by research, is very powerful for the lawmakers to hear, and powerful for other practitioners too. that there are people who have a lot of experience who have gone beyond or left these methods behind in favor of what turns out to be more effective. That's the nice thing about all of this, is that the alternatives to the coercive practices are both ethical, they're ethically superior, they're more effective, there are no sacrifices. They coincide with common morality, they're consistent with human rights perspectives, and they work better. So what we're trying to impress upon law enforcement is that banning maladaptive and counterproductive practices isn't taking away a tool from them. Mark said in one of these hearings that the police would not issue firearms that fire haphazardly, right? You wouldn't want that. That's not a good tool. So if somebody takes away from you your gun that goes off whenever it wants to, you should be thankful for that, because that weapon is dangerous. So that's sort of the rhetorical challenge that we're facing. It's this notion that they're being stripped of tools, but what has to be understood is that these tools were no good to begin with, and that there is a whole host of techniques that they could embrace that would improve their practice.
I think there's another element to that. There's, and understandable so, right? Many of the law enforcement are convinced that they, based on their decades-long experience, that they're convinced that they know what to do, right? And again, empirical science shows us that experience or years on the job does not improve accuracy, right? The problem is the more you are convinced about your proficiency in that specific area, the more likely you are to also be able to convince, let's say, a jury, right?
Yes.
But
Absolutely.
To create an image that I like to convey, imagine you're a golf player, right? You have one last shot, and between you and the hole is a forest. And next to the forest, in this triangle, you have a couple of people. But you want to get the ball directly into the hole. So you can shoot 1,000 times. You will not improve because you don't have direct evidence if you had it right or not. That's exactly the same situation for the police officers. Lies or deception are not detected in the moment. They're detected in retrospect, right? So you never have direct feedback, right? So, but I do understand from law enforcement, if you do this job for 20 years, of course you think, you have this gut. I had this exact discussion with someone from the Dutch law enforcement here, right? This gut feeling, what you need on the street, you cannot just drop it, yeah? But it's a 50-50 chance, right? In most incidents. Okay?
Yes. You're entirely correct, of course, that the environment in which most law enforcement learn is not optimal for tweaking their decision-making rules to become more accurate. This is exactly what you're pointing out. There's no clear, immediate feedback mechanism. One thing that I have found when encountering different forms of practitioners is that compared to law enforcement, people who are in the intelligence or counterintelligence domains tend to be more. This is not based on any scientific mapping I have done. This is just anecdotal based on my experience. That they tend to be more open to the possibility that they might not know everything, and also very keen to get things right. I will never forget one time when a person in an audience I was training was saying, I'm really pumped about this training that might give me, better techniques, because if I don't get it right, something goes boom and people die. So that's a very different kind. It's certainly not always the case that mistakes made during intelligence gathering have those kinds of clear, obvious feedback mechanisms, but they certainly exist to a higher degree than in law enforcement, where you can even have these self-fulfilling prophecies, confirmation bias, behavior confirmation biases. So it's not an ideal learning environment that they exist in. And earlier, when you were talking about negotiations and detecting deception in negotiations, and sort of guidelines for how to best do that. One thing that I think is important, although again this is not based on some scientific test, being humble and aware of the difficulty of the enterprise is very important, because this decision-making combo that we're looking at with the typical police officer in the United States, where they do not have a truth bias, right? From my knowledge, you see a difference when you compare European police officers to American ones, where American police officers typically display a lie bias. Not so much true for the European ones. So, but if we're talking about the United States cops, they believe, first of all, they're unlikely to be much more correct than chance, right? So they're relatively inaccurate. On top of that, they're lie biased, meaning that they are likely to classify you or judge you as suspicious. And number three, they're very confident in their abilities. That's a disastrous combo for an innocent person, right? It's a triple whammy. So entering into a situation where you have to make these decisions, to do that with an exaggerated degree of confidence is not a good idea.
Coming back to very briefly, I see I have overstayed my welcome, so I'll let you go in a second. Yeah, I discussed this actually with Tim Levine, because he said policemen also they're not lie biased; they're only less truth biased. And of course, we have to take the context into consideration. A policeman on the job, right, and policeman in everyday situation, right. So they also succumb to those primal forces that are working in us, only to a lesser degree. And lastly, I don't envy anybody in law enforcement. And again, I'm sitting here in the relatively safe Netherlands, but what I'm seeing here from 30 million homeless people, drug epidemic, right? What's now really trending everywhere are those, how do you call them, crowd plunderings of stores en masse, yeah? So seen from the distance, I mean, you're in New York. I mean, I don't know what's your experience here, yeah? But seen from the distance, it looks really like an empire that is crumbling, yeah? A society on its breakdown, right? And if you then in this environment, and you do it from beginning of the shift till the end of your shift, yeah? You come from one drama to the other, from one exceptional situation with high stress levels to another, right? And then you have to rely on faulty tools which were provided by you, right? This is a very bad situation to be in. I mean, for everybody involved, right?
Yes, I have the utmost respect for the very difficult tasks that police officers have to do as part of their work. There is absolutely no question about that. What they do need to do, though, in order for the system to have any semblance of functionality, is to make a fundamental transformation from this warrior mindset back to a guardian mindset. So, there are Norman Rockwell Americana kind of images of law enforcement helping little kids. The notion of and this shift in the role of law enforcement as guardians of the community versus warriors of the state is reflected in even in the names of certain agencies, like the immigration ICE, the enforcement, right? The agencies that were used to be services are now enforcements, and the
militarization of police.
The right? Militarization of the police, yes, exactly, is very problematic and is a step in the wrong direction when it comes to building community embraced policing. I think what the police need to do is to not just change to be community oriented, but they need to be community embraced. And that is going to take some work, and that includes taking a difficult look at the own practices and own up to what is not working.
For you, as coming from Sweden, again, my last question, I promise. Yeah? For you coming from Sweden, living in the United States, I don't know for how long you do this already, yeah? But you have the comparison, the true comparison between living in Europe and in the US with all that's going on right now in the world. And we had some issues in Sweden too. I mean, it's not so that nothing happens in Sweden, right? So how do you compare, in these critical times right now, the life between Europe and the US?
I've been living in the US for 17 years. America is a much less stable system, and with the rise of Trump and Trumpism, it's been very, very scary times. Where we've seen the rise and normalization of right-wing extremism. There's no question that Europe is battling with the same kind of extremism, but I think America takes home the trophy for the scariest manifestations of these very nasty anti-democratic
led from the top, huh? Led from the top.
Yes. It's a much more unwieldy reality. Talking specifically now about the enterprise of being engaged with law enforcement, it's much more complicated here and much less straightforward to bring about change. But I think there's so many indicators that course correction is indicated that it makes it very, very rewarding to work here. And the problems are significant, but that also means that we can accomplish significant change, substantive change for ideally a more just and fair system.
Very good. Those are fitting words at the end of our little conversation here. Hopeful words. I hope you're right. Maria, thank you so much for your time. It's really appreciated.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great talking to you.
Likewise.